Good to have you here. I'm Thiago, one of the members of the 10th Berlin Biennale curatorial team. And this is I'm Not Who You Think I'm Not, number 5, where we have the honor to have Christophe Cozier here. I'm Not Who You Think I'm Not is our public program, and it started 1 year before the exhibition opens. And I would say it was definitely, or I would say it was fundamental for us to think and to understand and to imagine how we would like this exhibition to be or to look like. The first program, the first event happened at EOTO, like Each One Teach One. That's a very interesting space, like a library, a cultural center in Vedin. Now they have a new address in Togostrasse. And there we had Jota Mombasa, who I imagine is around here, just there. Dona Kukama, and who is with us in spirit. And George Shearer, who is probably with us in spirit as well. And we've been organizing events. We have been having events, part of I'm Not Who You Think I'm Not, in Johannesburg, in Nairobi, here in Berlin, also with Okui, and now we get back to Berlin. And this is number 5. I'm Not Who You Think I'm Not, number 5. Throughout the whole exhibition until September, we will also have more events, so please follow us on Instagram and on our webpage. Okay, thanks for coming. I would like to pass on to Gabi.
Hello, thanks for coming in from the sun. But we promise it will be worth it, right? It is a great pleasure to welcome Chris Cozier to Berlin to be with us. Chris, and would like also to thank Davidoff Arts Initiative for bringing Chris to Berlin for a period of 2 months. And Chris is invited as a guest of the public program. I met Chris many years ago when I was very young. In Johannesburg was it 2000? Yeah, the year 2000. And I remember really being excited with his work, and just to meet someone from Trinidad and Tobago in Johannesburg was really special, because a lot of people who come from the Caribbean, for example, these exchanges hardly ever happen. So it was on point for us to travel together with Thiago to 6 Caribbean islands as part of our research. And we met again Chris, and he gave a beautiful lecture in a conference, Tilting Access, which was in the Cayman Islands, where we also went. And of course, when I met Chris in Johannesburg, I was still living in Durban. I was also in residence at the Bag Factory, where also Chris was. And, sorry. And I think these spaces or residence programs are quite interesting. We, as the Berlin Biennale team, we set up different residencies in different parts of the world, also thanks to Albertine and the Davidoff Institute. Mimi Cherono was in the Dominican Republic. Julia Phillips was in Brazil. Cynthia Marcel in Johannesburg. Portia in India, and also Tessa came to Berlin. And by these residencies, it's not that we send artists to fetch something, to bring it back. We just hope that by being in unfamiliar places, they would find conversations that that stretch their own practices and introduce more complexities into our questions. So it's a pleasure to have you, Chris, here to also perhaps reflect on these ideas of moving around, of dodging, always dodging. And I think also our public program, the title "I'm Not Who You Think I'm Not," is that it's a kind of a rope-a-dope moment. If you know rope-a-dope, or if you know Muhammad Ali, you would know this system that he devised in order to win a losing war or a fight in Zaire, which is now Congo, in 1974. So I wanted to read your bio, but I think this is not, you will read your own bio by talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Well, good evening. It's almost after 7. Oh, sorry. I'm just gonna show a couple images. Gabby said this is not a pedagogical exercise, so she didn't want me to read. And the only reason I'm standing behind this thing that looks like a podium is because I hate holding microphones. They make me very self-conscious, and I wouldn't be able to use my hands to explain myself. So I wanted to start with this. So it's going to be like a show and tell, and then I'll bring up some issues around and just share with you some things that I've been thinking about recently and where they. So it's a combination of work by other people and of course some things from my own practice. I thought I'd start with this strange image because I'm in Germany and I don't know if most people in the room, if they are from Germany and from other places outside of the British sort of ex-colonial conversation, would know what the hell these men are up to. And I think it kind of talks a little bit about the shifts, and because actually coming from a place like Trinidad, where some, things like people like C.L.R. James, who wrote about cricket, there's an assumption that even though my parents sent me to Harvard's cricket clinic, that's what cricket school is called, I was absolutely terrible at cricket, and which casts a lot of doubt on my sort of credentials as a West Indian. And not only was I terrible at cricket, but I kind of like that American documentary series that says we're bad at sports, to interview artists. So, but why this image interests me is it's that weird moment in cricket where somebody makes a play and then the players appeal to either shake them up to make them feel, insecure, or to try to kind of nudge the umpire into making a decision against them, that they're out and they must leave the field. But to somebody who's unfamiliar with the sport, they don't just know what the hell these guys are up to. And why the image interests me and of late is that when I was a small child listening to cricket commentary, I confused the word umpire with empire. So I thought these guys were appealing to the empire. And I was completely confuffled. But it kind of defines the relationship, and I don't mean this disparagingly, the shift in relationships, because in terms of the West Indian or the Caribbean construction of self, so a lot has been written about the relation of cricket to that of a certain generation. Obviously, for my generation, soccer is more, and other sports have become more dominant. But what's really interesting is the shift of dynamics, because of course, beating England is no longer a consequential thing. It's now, we're playing in a slightly different global landscape against India, Pakistan, South Africa, you know, and so on. So this kind of notion of appealing to the umpire or appealing seems to define a past vocabulary in terms of the relevance of the action. And I think that talks a lot about some of the things Gabby and Leah are talking about. Like, I'm supposed to be a Caribbean person. I'm supposed to have this particular vocabulary, but it actually is no longer relevant to, you know, it's not. So I want to start the present. I thought I'd just start with this weird image to kind of wonder how many of us even know what the hell this person is doing. And then I want to ask the guy inside to share a video with you all. And then after that, I will move ahead. So the video is by an artist from the Bahamas called Heino Schmidt, and I'll talk a little bit about it after. Okay. So we can go back to the PowerPoint now. Yeah. So why am I taking so much time to show you this video? I mean, it's a video I'm fascinated by. It was produced in a space it originated from a space I run in Port of Spain called Alice Yard. And the artist was in Trinidad for a period of time in 2010. And what was going on is he was looking at a kind of drug addict, you know, itinerant person who was balancing bottles on the side of the road to attract, you know, get money from people drinking in a popular bar. And the artist was invited to represent the Caribbean in the Liverpool Biennial of the following year. And so he started reflecting on this feat, this magic trick, this exercise. And he went to London in a colleague Blue Curry studio, and they did a shoot in which he kind of mastered the art of trying to get that bottle to balance, which involves a little bit of water. And the piece was called Temporary Horizons. And it talks about that repeating gesture of trying to get something to balance, and it collapses, which talks to some degree about around that period, you know, there was the earthquake in Haiti, there were the various hurricanes, and this sense of the instability of the world and the struggle of the artist to try to, you know, maintain balance, so to speak. But it also talked about something else, the journey. The artist is from Nassau. The idea is generated in Port of Spain. It's finalized or, you know, sort of honed in London, presented in Liverpool. But the wall graphic just says, this is Heino Schmidt from Nassau. He's representing the Caribbean in the Liverpool Biennial. So it's already in contention with the way in which it becomes visible. And to some degree, what is becoming more and more interesting to me looking at these works is that tension between the wall graphic, the work, and the encounter. So, so I kind of want to share with you some works that, in my own development years, works that carry the same tension. I won't, like this is a work produced in Port of Spain in 1981. It really comes up in conversations about the Caribbean or Latin America, but it's around the time of the Reagan Thatcher years, and the piece was called the Caribbean Basin after the Caribbean Basin Initiative. And at the time, the artist produced this work after having a Rastafarian vision. And, but we don't associate that kind of conceptualism with Rastafarianism, and we don't associate, say, the influence of Jamaican culture in the Caribbean outside of a kind of language around the intuitive and that kind of thing. And the three holes in the bucket, in the vernacular, that the idea can't hold water, which is the Caribbean, Ronald Reagan's Caribbean Basin Initiative, are Cuba, Nicaragua, and Grenada. In the first version, these were rusty holes in the Basin Initiative. In this later version of the piece, which I unearthed because he had abandoned making work in that way, and the piece had been left somewhere and nobody even took it seriously, I asked him to show it again in the early 90s. And he decided to chew chewing gum and stuff Nicaragua and Grenada, because at that point, Grenada had been already invaded, and the Nicaragua regime things had shifted the other way. So it spoke about the presence of the GI and the chewing of gum. A piece produced in that same period was one in which the artist used, called Mortar and Pestle, used stratified rock, which is geological time, to be contained by compressed newspaper to kind of hold the balance between sort of historical narratives and geological, progression of time, and what is the relationship between the two. So a lot of these artists were thinking about these kinds of concepts in the early 80s, but I noticed in my research these gestures didn't fit. That's not the way the Caribbean is understood in terms of how it is curatorially constructed. And all of these pieces have a kind of geography in terms of how the artist is navigating space, in terms of, of course, a basin like that is probably made in China or something. It ends up in a haberdashery in Port of Spain. He goes and he buys it. He puts it out in the sun, uses some kind of chemical agent to exacerbate or speed up as a catalyst for the rust. These compressed newspaper things were made in London. They were brought back to Trinidad, turned into this form, and then, the stratified rock was collected in the Northern Range and so on. And then I think I want to talk a little bit also about how we understand the Caribbean in terms of visual vocabulary. We know a lot about the visit of people like André Breton going to Haiti and discovering the intuitives. We know in the context of Jamaica, the narratives about, these self-taught painters and so on. But what's interesting is that this image, which is the image of Brother Prince Emmanuel, which is the son of Ras Daniel Hartman, is one of the most popular Jamaican images there is, outside of a photo of Bob Marley. And this artist, whose work has been reproduced in albums, in cartoons, all kinds of popular forms, to people of my generation who grew up in the 70s, enraptured by that kind of moment. We didn't get the Beatles, we had the Wailers. So it's this image is iconographic, but it never comes up in conversations in conventional museum environments about the Caribbean, much less Jamaica. And it's deeply ironic. The artist, though, does come up, if any of you have seen The Harder They Come, because in The Harder They Come, the train track scene where it is actually the artist who appears as the Rastafarian with his children and this young man at the time would, So it's interesting, this visibility and invisibility, and how these narratives are constructed. I don't spend much time with this. This is another colleague, the work I'm from. This is all work. The Daniel Hartman, of course, is late 60s, early 70s. This is early 80s contemporary work. And in this piece by artist of Indian descent from Trinidad, Wendy Nanan, she talks about the meeting point between Kali and the Virgin Mary. And it depicts a wedding scene between Krishna and the Virgin Mary, or what in the context of Trinidad is called Kali Mai, which is the village of Siparia, where women of Indian origin and African or Catholic backgrounds fight to carry a statue which they both believe carries the attributes of both cultural and religious philosophies. So she used that image to talk about this weird moment where the garland is used in the Hindu wedding, where you can see how randy the face of the god is, and how alarmed the bride is, because it's the first time she realized he's got some extra arms, and what's interesting about this is when people do curatorial projects about the Caribbean, they almost try to recreate that sort of Europe's encounter with Africa, but they never underscore the fact that large populations in the Caribbean are also from India. And I'm not saying this to kind of run some kind of rationalization, but it was kind of deeply ironic when the Crossroads show happened in New York. That was the narrative construction of it. And that same weekend the show opened, there was a large pagua out in Queens. And a young writer, I think it was Andel Gosain from Canada, mentioned that, how deeply ironic that was. Because the pagua out in Queens, which is what Indians in India call Holi, had never really gotten to that size. And the fact that it had gotten to that size has a lot to do with the fact that it was Caribbean immigrants searching for visibility, using sort of like the carnivalesque to position themselves within the narrative of New York. And of course, the Crossroads show opens oblivious to that narrative, which is an interesting question about how these things are constructed and how it fails to register the kind of geography and the movement of people. This is I'm not going to talk too much about this. Again, there's cross-referencing with religion and culture and contemporary conversations. These are some foundational works for me in terms of how my own practice developed. I left the islands in the early 80s and studied in Baltimore to be a painter, and then in New York to be an artist. Because of course I went to MICA, and it was around the time where people were doing big masculine-sized paintings, and often Americans don't pronounce T's, so a lot of them were painting, and it's really weird moment. And I love my training; it was good training, but I just couldn't paint anymore, so for whatever it's worth, when I left the Caribbean, these works were the works that were in my mind, and I was trying to figure out what was the shape of my discomfort and what was the shape of my discontent. It wasn't exclusively about, I suppose, never imagining I would end up in some place like the Berlin Biennial, because in that era, the art world was a couple of blocks downtown in Manhattan, and people would ask you if they needed, what inoculations they needed to go to Brooklyn. There's another version of the piece in Havana. And this was one of the first pieces I did when I returned to the Caribbean. I kind of lost interest in making things, and I started working with craftsmen. And I made these glasses and these objects that talked about the social condition, because of course, these are the burglar bars. A glass is made out of the decorative burglar bars that were appearing on the houses as people began to get more and more insecure. So it became a kind of narrative about that relationship. And I also did some experiments with performance, and this is kind of what brings me to this kind of conversation I'm trying to have with you all. And one of these performances I did, which was in 1991, was sort of influenced a little bit by Jonathan Borofsky and some of the, not Jonathan Borofsky, sorry, Vitor Conchi, and some of the crazy things he did. I was a student, I encountered him when I was a graduate student, and people like himself and many others. And So when I went home, I started questioning making things altogether. And I kind of wondered the degree toward which objects and actions could have the same agency within the social space. And one of the first pieces I did was I did a performance where I told people that I would have a conversation with a shirt jack in a certain location, and they could come and hear what this conversation would be. Of course, the shirt jack is a very particular garment worn by politicians of the 60s and 70s, Bandung, African leaders, and it has no, it has like epaulets, it's got military pockets. So it looks a little bit like a bush jacket, but they use suit material. So it's kind of weird to have something that looks like a bush jacket, but with suit material. So and the jacket was actually mine that I wore to a graduation when I was 16. I wanted one because a politician in Trinidad at the time was told he couldn't enter the parliament wearing one. He had to wear a suit, which then, of course, takes us back to the conversation about appealing to the empire. The suit was mine. It couldn't fit me anymore, of course. I'd put on some weight. I'd gotten older. It was like 10, almost 12 years later. And then I kind of measured it and analyzed it. And I said, oh, the politician wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to be as radical as Che and Fidel, but he also wants to be as regal as Prince Philip. So what decision? And then I had a conversation with him about masculine power. What was really weird about that moment was that I thought I didn't rehearse, I had no plan, very much like this moment now. In talking to the shirt, I was also kind of looking at this notion about eloquence and poise and all the kinds of things that comes from what are the expectations of education and training and things like that. So I kind of ran out of things to say to the shirt, and I was really asking it questions about the political environment. What completely confused me is that members of the audience started tapping me on my shoulder, and I thought they meant, stop it, you're being a bore. But actually, they wanted to talk to the shirt too. And then it turned into this weird situation of people lining up to talk to the shirt, which became a kind of metaphor for a politician of a certain dispensation and era. And that really puzzled me. And I think it's around that time that this question about objects and actions really came into shape for me. So a lot of the work of this period was all these kinds of actions. I won't talk too much about them, but what I was really going after at the time was this notion of who's included and who's excluded in the construction of cultural identity, nationhood, and all of these gifts from Europe, so to speak. And this kind of notion of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so I spent a lot of the 90s working my way through that. And that's actually what led me to come to South Africa, because I was very interested in the fact that South Africa in 1994 had recently become an independent nation. It had been sort of unlocked from a certain colonial relationship. We embarked upon that enterprise in the 60s, early 60s, and I kind of wanted to be in that sort of brand new environment, because I was a kid when it happened to us, and I didn't really understand what it was about. And I was curious about that kind of sort of semi-colonial space and what the dynamics are. Because the Caribbean isn't really so much about, doesn't really have that culture of indigenousness as well. It's more to do with a transplanted labor, because Caribbean societies, the foundation is really labor camps of Europe trying to evolve into societies. I investigated a lot in music as well, popular music, and I started doing sound installations, working with DJs and so on. So this is still sort of late and early late 90s and so on. And I started thinking a lot about if there are 4 speakers in the corner of a room and it's playing music, it's the physical sound is creating a space as well as the content of the music is creating a mental space as well. And I kind of grew up in that era in the 70s of the kind of what they call the blockorama or the dancehall space. So I was trying to map it out, a kind of ideological space. And I think that circle kind of stays in my thinking about a lot of things. It gets permeable at sometimes, it stays intact at others. because I think that kind of slippage of going in and out of a kind of space, if you look at the films about parties and dances and so on, people make a circle and then somebody jumps into the center and then they jump back into the ring, and the ring intersects with other rings and in a social space. And I was trying to think about that. And of course, issues around gender started coming up for me because, of course, this is the dancehall singer. He's the AK-47 with the two dancing girls on the side. So it starts to talk about the gender and the problematics of the musical form as well. And these series, I've kind of done that. I'm not sure I'd return to it, but it was kind of interesting, which brings me to my conversation with Gabby and with the biennial in a sense, because in the early 2000s, I did a project in Copenhagen when I was invited. And at the time, Denmark was shifting to the right, so we know about that. It comes and goes. And they wanted artists to do projects. And it was something very weird. I was invited to come there, and it brought up all kinds of problems about visa and travel. And I realized, yes, I'm kind of coming into this game, but there's a whole other side to the game that was new to me. What kind of visa I need, how much money, and that kind of thing. And I decided to fence benches in the park at the center where the place was, just as the spring was coming, and then people would have to apply for forms to get keys to sit in the park. And if I liked them, I would put a stamp, and the stamp, which you can barely see there, declared them an Odaban of space. And they could open the key and sit in the park bench. And if I didn't like them, I would render them an itinerant. And this runaway slave image from, kind of posters from the 18th century and 19th century came into my practice. And I kind of worked out a narrative at the time where I drew one, which was a guy running away with the briefcase. And his name was, and he's such a polite boy. And then I had the guy running with the bag, and I called him Heading North. And then I had this other image. And these were images I got from history books. And then the one on the left is one I made myself. And it's really talking about on an island, that you live on, where maybe 50% of the deposits in the bank are controlled by 2% of the depositors, And, so there's a kind of a conversation about who's staying, who's leaving, who's on the move. And then this whole construct about wholeness and incompleteness, which I think has a particular meaning in the context of places like Germany, who belongs, who doesn't belong. And the way cultures like that I come from are seen as evolving towards having an identity. And then this notion of identity, whether defined by nation or ethnicity, defines a kind of completeness or wholeness. And I kind of started to question that you have to become this thing to be relevant. So then I kind of said, well, then what am I? What was I all along as I was going about my business? I kind of work a lot with other artists. So this particular image I've always liked, and it's an image by an artist, young artist from Trinidad called Marlon Griffith, where a lot of the young women in Trinidad like to powder their chest to say that they've just bathed. We don't know, like schoolgirls do it, and you don't know if it's linked to, the powdering coming from the French in the 19th century, or whether it comes from some kind of working class thing about I just bathed, I'm fresh, because I collected water. But then to use the brand name pattern, so he made all these templates where they could make it glamorous. And it talks about the kind of consumer life. So the school uniform is recognizable within the context of Trinidad. And of course, those who live in the international consumer game will recognize the powder patterns on her chest. I want to get to something. Some of these images I'm showing are from a project, but I'll get back to it. I want to talk now about something that I'm working on, because I run a space called Alice Yard. So what this is all about, I'm really showing a couple of projects I do where I basically invite artists from around the region who do projects that have that kind of collaborative, intuitive, like this is a a project by an artist from Bermuda. And what he does is he takes a walk on the beach, and whatever he finds, he connects it to his head. And he calls them sculptures, you know, temporary sculptures, and he takes photos, and that's it. And they tell stories about all kinds of things. And I did a project in the yard called The Performative Moment a few years ago, and I was intrigued by these images and about the documentation of performance as well as performance itself. Another artist I'm very close to and I work with a lot is Marcel Piñas from Suriname, of Maroon origin. And he works in collaboration with the people of his village. So many of his pieces are large things done by people in the village. And it's another way of articulating presence because, of course, the hands, the fingers of the children in the village that he works with is always evident. And it's another way of articulating presence. So the work isn't really made by him, and a lot of these works move around, and they're made collectively. You know, like, and I've been kind of fascinated about a different way. And of course, there are examples of that in other cultures, but I'm interested in Marcel's relationship to the contemporary space and this sense of preserving an indigenous presence through contemporary practice. I'm gonna run through because you'll get bored, and many of the projects that happen in the space in Trinidad, called Alice Yard, which is a space for what we try to do is it's like an experimental space, and things kind of fail or they work, and so like this project, which Ebony Patterson from Jamaica did in the yard. She came there for a week and she noticed that, so I'm under the lights, it's really weird, so I can't get feeling like I'm performing. But anyhow, she came to visit us for a week, and during that week, she read the newspapers and began to notice, well, the amount of murders that were happening daily, and she made a coffin for each report of a young person being shot. And then she left the coffins in the yard, and then on one night she asked people to come and to carry the coffins around the neighborhood. And it's in a neighborhood where there's lots of popular clubs and bistros and stuff like that. So it was quite disturbing for this to be going on, you know, the coffins to be moving around that neighborhood while people are drinking and having a good time. That project, of course, developed further and became part of Claire Tancon's Armas project, which is still, I think, traveling around now. And a project that talks about, you know, the relationship between the carnivalesque, the public space, curatorial practices, and where that fits in to the whole shifting conversation around performance. And perhaps in our own narrative in the Caribbean, we may not locate performance as part of our contemporary conversation, say as beginning at that intersection with the Euro-American narrative, which is located more, I suppose, in things like the Cabaret Voltaire, as opposed to, in our context, in the carnivalesque space of the 19th century. So all of these projects we do in the yard, and I try to work out these things. Blue Curry was here, there. I'm getting lost. And again, you know, artists are moving from one place to the next. And what I'm becoming interested in is, I think this piece, he's collecting these combs wherever he goes. So combs here come from India, parts of London, haberdasheries, and then in Port of Spain. And then they kind of assemble these temporary sculptures. And, you know, and it opens a really interesting kind of dialogue. We worked together on a project called the Out of Place Project, and it started to talk about questions of authorship, questions of collaboration, and questions of placement of the work outside of institutional structures. One of my favorite projects from this whole enterprise was we worked with a popular street painter, and we went to different vendors and asked them to design specials. And so if you get to them on a certain day, you could get a special based on Blue's name. So you could get a Blue Curry special snow cone, a Blue Curry special haircut. And people really enjoyed this. In fact, I think I'm correct. Blue is here. I think when he went to collect this sign back from the ice vendor, he said, no, leave it. I had a good day, you know, because lots of people came saying, I'd like a Blue Curry special, you know. So, and it really changes the public's relationship to practice and kind of very proactively says, well, you know, maybe we don't need big white boxes. We don't need to recreate that narrative to bring value to what we do. That's a Blue Curry special sign. This is another project that I really found interesting. This is a young artist from Jamaica, Kellyanne Lindo. And, you know, this whole culture of barrel children, people sending things, you know, the whole kind of remittance economies that we deal with. And so she hadn't seen her parents for many years, and they live somewhere in Miami, and they're stuck there illegally. Oh, sorry. So her only relationship is through the things that come in the barrel. And so she collected barrels and tried to make this work. But this work, first it started with a gesture of just 2 barrels, and then we shot it, and then she worked with another artist to kind of use Photoshop to make the barrel kind of indicate some sense of distance. So the way the work comes together is, you know, the artist was in St. Vincent, Kelly is from Jamaica, this is done in Trinidad, and then it kind of goes back. But again, you know, the wall labels and the way in which visibility is articulated, she has to be from a specific place, she has to be the sole manufacturer, and none of the conversations around the work comes. So I'm going to jump from there, and while we're on that subject, and I want to talk about a project that I did in Chicago, where basically I'm coming to the sort of where my head is right now. There are 2 or 3 projects I'm developing. This project I did in Chicago in 2014. It's called the Gasmen, or entanglements, according to how you deal with it. And I was taking walks on Lake Michigan, and I suddenly felt a sense of displacement, because there are times when the color of the water and the atmosphere could almost be like a beach in the Caribbean, and then out of the corner of the eye, you might see a block of ice passing, you know, and then of course it's cold. And I began to also think a lot about being an artist and how, like, I'm thinking about Trinidad, but I'm actually in Chicago. But I'm not just thinking about Trinidad exclusively, I'm also thinking about the kind of global economy of oil, because Trinidad is one of the first places in the world that oil was, you know, drilled for and dug out of the ground. And I had this idea of I grew up watching Kung Fu movies, so I had and Westerns, so I had this idea of getting guys to go on the beach with gas nozzles. And I'll share a little bit of the video with you, and then could you show the Gasmen video? Just a little touch of it. How we doing? Okay, and could you show the next one? Could you show the other video now? The globe? Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so you can take off the video now. Yeah. Oh, he's not hearing me. Oh. Okay, great. So with this piece, this version of it actually was at the Eli Broad Museum at MSU that was put together by Yasumi Omulu, who I was happy to see here sometime earlier this afternoon. I don't know if she's here for the actual talk, but the geography of this piece is really interesting. When I did it, it suddenly occurred to me that one could be anywhere, and I shot it in Chicago. I worked with musicians in Trinidad, and then I kind of assembled, and then I did versions of it in Costa Rica, in Michigan, and then in Gary, Indiana, in an abandoned supermarket or something. And to me, what's interesting about this is that how do you begin to talk about that kind of different kind of production, and how, and then people say weird things to me. You're from the Caribbean. I thought you should be talking about identity or sugar or plantation economies or something. And I'm thinking, like, good Lord. I do a lot of drawings as well. I wouldn't spend much time with them, but the drawings talk a lot about this kind of stuff. But what I really want to share with you all is where I am now. So I'll show you this. So I did a Rauschenberg residency in Captiva Island, and I got really interested in, I'd never had a lot of ecological conversations, even though I live on an island. And a lot of the people there were talking about, well, the rising water levels and stuff like that. And but what they were saying kind of really interested me. They would say, well, you guys out there in the rest of the world, you must do this or you must do that. And it suddenly occurred to me, listening to the conversations, that people out there around the world have always been on the move, if not for slavery, disasters, wars. And then if you do some analysis of late, a lot of the research that people are dealing with, even in places like the Amazon, they're beginning to speculate as to whether it's virgin forest or not, most of it, or parts of it. Because, some of those groups, they're finding these circles where they lived on mounds. So, it's kind of, so a young artist that I was in dialogue with there started talking about the prospect of water levels creating new social relations, beyond religion, different kinds of things, because in a way, and I also realized that being afloat is a kind of metaphor that's been hovering in my work. So I started building these heads that just float around, and that talk about being between things, between states, between cultures. And most of the Caribbean is really water. It's really about the sea, with these small island states. And the indigenous people moved, and the land really only became what it is under the auspices of, kind of colonial and industrial enterprises. So I've been kind of thinking a lot about being afloat and about being on the move. And I've been fascinated by the fact also that this work, which I think showed in LA recently and is now moving to New York in the Relational Undercurrent show that's curated by Tatiana Flores. People go to the museum and they make their own movies of this piece and put it on Instagram. And I was really fascinated by how that breaches the kind of relationship to the institutional space, because they own the work by doing this. And I've been really fascinated watching the versions that they create, how well composed and what they're trying to do on Instagram, because the work was not actually made by me, I kind of designed it. And then you just have to cut some wood and cut out those heads and suspend them from the ceiling and light it and so on. And I'm kind of interested in that process, because in the early days I did work like that simply because I didn't have the money or the backing to ship work and insure it and participate. So I started designing things that could just be made out of sticks and cardboard. And that has a kind of history in the carnival production that I did as a child. I grew up around mass camps building and making things in the Trinidad Carnival. And I never really made that connection, of the technology of making things to occupy space with very limited means. The most recent project I've been doing and I'm going to kind of stop and bring you all into the conversation. I was asked to come to Boston last year to work with a kind of social practice group called DS4, Design for Social Intervention, Kenny Bailey. And when I met them when Kenny was giving a workshop at the, what is it called? At Row House Projects in Houston, because I was really fascinated by the connection between what they are doing and what we were trying to do in Aliciad in Port of Spain. And what happened was he started talking about what is the artist's relationship to social issues, and whether you should abandon your skill set or whether you should stick to it in these negotiations with communities, and what are the ethics and what are the... So he said, well, I was kind of intrigued by some of the questions he'd asked, so he asked me to come and work with him in the Dudley Uphams area in Boston. And it was a very interesting exercise, in that every idea I came up with didn't work because there was some reason why the community didn't like it, why the owners of land and property or the developing company didn't like it. And it was an interesting way to work as an artist, because you're never accountable when you're making something, unless a critic doesn't like it or something, or the public, but to be actually involved in the process and somebody say, no, that's not going to fly for this reason. And while the project was going on, out of sheer desperation, I built this red step and took it into an empty lot and left it there, because I was thinking about chattel housing and worker housing, and a lot of the people in that community come from, Ghana, Cape Verde, parts of the Caribbean, and these steps one associates with barrack housing and chattel housing, and also just kind of the humble origins that some people come from, and it also to some degree represents the place you left and the place you never quite get back to as you try to build a new home elsewhere. And so it kind of became like a kind of portal in a kind of Stargate sense, in that kind of cheesy American TV show. Because if you drop down a step, you start imagining what's not there. And then people were coming up and saying, what's that step doing here? Because that step isn't associated, per se, with the US. There's a stoop and there are other kinds of things, but this kind of inferred other locations. And then I designed a poster which would allow me to send the design to other places, so that other people. So I've done collaborations with artists in Colombia, Jamaica, at home, and in Boston. So this is me in Colombia trying to move it, because there was an idea. The artists in Colombia said I should move it from downtown Bogota and Septima to the School of Architecture, because at the School of Architecture, the traditional building was destroyed, demolished to build a new building. So they wanted to move the step there to underscore that loss that they would never get back. And then I did versions in Kingston, and I'm Boston, and I'm doing. And then weird things happened. Like I left it around the space at Aliciad. And I found out a rap video was made on it. So I found the rap video, and then the guy was terrified. Would I have to pay copyright and fees? And I said, no, this is great. Just tell me, give me the YouTube link, So that's the guy rapping on my step, but it's perfect. The most recent enterprise, I was walking, and this says a lot about my own practice and how I think. I walk around the city often, and I noticed that they were renovating an old colonial house, and they just broke the gate and they broke the headstone and threw it in the street, and it was there for weeks. So one day I decided to get some artists together and to try to move it, which was impossible because the mortar they used in that era is so heavy. And it started to talk about that relationship to history and that loss or that gain. And and sometimes how irreconcilable or how difficult it is, to put things back in order. You never quite get it back. And so I did a video in which I tried to move the headstone, the capital headstone, and with no luck. So, yeah. And then I created this kind of, the real stone with the photo of the missing stone. So I think I'm going to stop here and bring you all into the conversation, because I've brought up a lot of points. But I mean, what I'm really talking about is that I'm very interested in the fact that a lot of production is about people being on the move, and very often at the juncture of visibility, there's a kind of requirement of fixity. And I heard a really interesting presentation by a critic from India, and I'm just having a blank right now, where they spoke about the wall graphic as a report card, about a kind of way it rationalizes one's presence. But I'm not so interested in complaining about those things. What I'm more interested in is what demands these shifting works, moving between locations in terms of their production and the artists, make on how we can begin to see them and understand them. Because very often we come up with very sort of expedient rationales. This is from here, this is what it's about, and this is the meaning of that particular location. Or that's the meaning of that work because it comes from that location, before we even question or think about the fact that maybe the thing isn't really from where it appears, or the way in which we define appearance it appears to be. Which brings us back to the concept of how do we look at, what is the way to kind of look, feel, and encounter these works. And I'm going to stop here and bring you all in. Sorry, thank you.
So thank you very much for your very generous presentation. I think what interested me in the presentation that I saw at the Cayman Islands is your ability to think about your work in relation also to other practices and works, which stretches the conversation. There was also, because we made this trip to 6 islands together with Tiago for our research trip, there was somehow an expectation that the focus is on the Caribbean, which is not necessarily the case. I think for us it was interesting to come to the Caribbean because me personally, I could not afford to not think about that region when I work, and I wanted it to be part of a conversation rather than a focus. And to bring this artist into that conversation. You spoke about this idea of fugitivity when we had our discussion, and there is an essay by Jota Mombasa in the catalog where she also discusses these things. There's a line that is beautiful it blew my mind, and she writes, "My body passes through the art world at times, running." So this idea of being a fugitive or feeling like one is a guest who comes to activate something, but then you don't really necessarily belong to a place is quite strong. I also enjoyed your ideas around the balancing act, and I think that's exactly what I always go back to when I think about projects or teach. I did maybe 10 years ago together with my friend Sorob a project called Rope-a-Dope to win a losing war. And just to explain also this concept more further, Muhammad Ali did not necessarily fight George Foreman for 7 rounds. He kind of balanced on the ropes and made, in order to make him work harder and become tired. So at the eighth round, he had still energy. And then, you know, he kind of strike him once, and that was the end of the match. And this term, you know, kept on coming back when we did this project in New York, because it was also the elections, first running of Barack Obama to the office of the presidency. And it kept on coming back to discuss how he, you know, how his campaign was run. And he even had a picture of Muhammad Ali in his office. And it became quite interesting as a way to think about this strategy of always, you know, kind of moving like this. So, or of our refusals that are also highlighted in the title. I'm not who you think I'm not. It's a way to kind of clear that space so that you can be freer perhaps later. But I just wanted to say that and also open up the conversation, maybe comments and questions to Chris. There are 2 mics that are moving around.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Gabby, and the whole team of Berlin Biennial for having us here. And of course, thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Before I go into my question, I actually wanted to respond to Gabby's rope-a-dope metaphor with a Caribbean metaphor of some of the tactics of defeating that are used by people of the Caribbean, and that's also the title of a great Caribbean magazine, Small Axe. If you are the big tree, I am the small axe, and I'm going to cut you down. So that's another way in which, as small island people, we go at the seemingly undefeatable big trees. So that's just another, you know, there's the rope-a-dope, there's leaning back, and there's wearing out, and there's also attacking precisely on the same place, time and again and again. So just to balance with another Caribbean metaphor, which seems fitting to Chris's presentation. And now onto my question, Chris, stemming from one of your comments, to do with the way in which the white cube continues to be the space of validation, and the way in which looking at the kinds of practices, artistic practices, aesthetic practices of the Caribbean, which so often happen in the yard, to speak to Alice Yard, which is where you develop your residency and curatorial practice, to speak, of course, of the street or the road. So why is it indeed, including within the context of the Berlin Biennial, that the white cube, or certainly the exhibitionary complex, continues to appear to be the space of validation and legitimization of so many of our practices, which are not necessarily thought in relationship to it, originate from it, and are ultimately meant to reside thus? So that's my question to you, Chris. Why do you think that continues to be the case? Maybe that's a question to Gabby, maybe that's a question to the team, the curatorial team, in terms of the spaces which the Biennial chose to inhabit.
I don't know, I can't speak for Gabby. But yeah, but I think, but I don't know. I mean, I like this notion in Gabby's text and a lot of this kind of rethinking binaries, because one of the dangers of those kind of polemics is that it's either this or it's that. And I think, yes, I do concede that in terms of my own experiments, I'm kind of fascinated by the things that in the Caribbean space that I don't use the word distinguishes is kind of too much, but yeah, it's the things that happen between institutional spaces, you know, and it kind of, in my own writing and thinking, I have this term I call the complex complex. Like artists are always arguing, we need a museum, we need the big building to do dance. But some of the best dance is happening in the Caribbean. It's happening in kind of Shango Palais and voodoo and between spaces, in yards and, on the street. When I was a teenager growing up, some of the best dancing I saw was in the Blockaramas. It wasn't in the, in the proscenium dance theater hall. And so there's a kind of way that maybe it's not one or the other, is that it kind of inserts itself into these spaces, and then one has to rethink the agency of these spaces as well. I'm just speculating, In other words, its operational possibility is much more malleable than we think. It's not so much that it belongs there and not there. And maybe that's the question, for Gab. No, it's just kidding. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, Claire, to what you are addressing.
Do you want me to say something? I like the white cube. I do. I mean, but at the same time, I don't want to talk about the white cube, because I don't think this is a question for me. A lot has been said about the white cube, and I realized when I started the Center for Historical Reenactments, I was talking in a conference in New York and showing some images of projects that we were doing, and then people start to talk about the white cube. And for me to refuse this conversation, it was really important to focus on the window of the space, to write the text about this window and to treat it as a space and not to be so precious about the walls, and because the walls of the space were black because Kimang needed them to make a drawing, not because of anything else. And so I didn't want to be bogged down by these. These are not my problems necessarily, and I wanted a space where I can develop my own problems, or my own questions. So when I do work in white cubes or spaces, I just treat it as a convenience, an inconvenient convenience.
Hi. I just have a question for Christopher. You sort of mentioned the Caribbean as a labor project for the empire, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that historically, and then how does a Caribbean artist then make work that somehow isn't always in dialogue with the colonial, if that's the case? Or how do you have a fugitivity from that? How can one develop that?
Well, I'm not sure if that's a unique question to to be in Caribbean, but I think yes, the Caribbean is what's interesting, I suppose, about the Caribbean is it's like the first experiment, one of the first experiments. I mean, we kind of, it's one of those places on the world where you come, you kind of wipe out the natural environment, to plant sugar, you import populations, it's a really strange space. And we've kind of forgotten how weird this concept was, to build an industrial labor camp. Because now we think of them as countries, but when they came into existence, they were just external labor camps of Europe, for the European kingdoms, to build and enrich themselves. And the populations that existed there were forcibly brought there to produce this value, to basically build these environments, to build that white box, I mean, when you think about it, the Tate, was Tate and Lyle, which was one of the biggest plantations in the Caribbean. There's a little tin, it's called Lion's Golden Syrup, and it says, through what? Through sweetness brings strength, or strength through sweetness. You know, it's like, I feel like I should, but how much work from the Caribbean is in the Tate's collection compared to what it supports? You know, so all over the world, these kinds of dichotomies exist. Yeah, we kind of know that. Yeah, and then the problem for us in the Caribbean and places like the Caribbean is how do we then embark upon developing, you know, societies that are human, because this longer history, like, okay, like if you look at a country like Trinidad, where I'm from, we're just 50 years old. Our longer history is our colonial history. What is colonial history? It's theft and violence. So then the question is, how do you build a civil society after 300 years of that? Like, we will have to be heroes. But maybe we don't need heroes. Well, I mean, I don't want to be flippant about it, but it's true. It's like an amazing enterprise to just not feel like killing people, you know? And then, you know, and then we're supposed to forget it. It's just a, you know, thing. Get on with your life, you know, get yourself together. You know, and then when, you know, so there's a lot of things you have to work through just to feel sane. Because every time you go digging, you know, if you understand what I'm saying, every time you go digging, you find out something worse than you didn't know the time before. That you're living on this tainted soil, you know. So it's a very interesting environment because, you know, people go there and they think it's lovely. They're out on the beach. But they don't know if that beach was a landing point to come and there was a battle on that beach, you know, and a person come and put up a flag and say, I call this that. And they, you know, you don't know what happened on that beach. And some of the names of the places sometimes are named after battles, you know, and now there are people in bikinis. It's a different kind of occupation. I mean, one of my favorite projects by Blue Curry years ago was the Beach Towel project, where he used beach towels as flags, because that's like one of the most recent forms of occupation. When you land on a cruise ship, you get a towel, and then you get on the beach and you say, this is my space, and then you lie down on it. You know, it's like, so there's still that siege of territory, you know, that's constantly going on the beach. And we just take it for granted. That's your right. I've paid my ticket, I'm on my cruise, and I throw my towel on the beach and I occupy this space. And I enjoy the sun and the climate. You know, it's like, wow. You know.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Kate?
Thank you, Chris, for your talk. This is a question for both of you, because I think maybe you've got a couple of different angles on this. I'm wondering, in your own opinions and in your own experience, the difference between the way that you talk and the way that you are thinking about the issues that you care about now versus the 1990s version of identity politics and the whole kind of post-colonial conversation that first started. Because I know you've both had experience of both times, and it's interesting now. I wonder when you're working with younger artists who didn't necessarily go through the conversation that started kind of adamantly in the 1990s, what the differences are, or the different ways of kind of addressing, or is it a case of kind of repeating conversations with different people, or is there a different kind of narrative that's coming through for you?
I don't understand the chronology. Why is the 90s significant?
It was just because when you were talking about your own practice, and you were saying in the 1990s,
oh, yeah, okay.
you were
No, it was just incidental in the sense that, okay, I'm a certain age, so I was in art school in the 80s in the US, and I returned to the Caribbean in the 90s, and I was kind of investigating those things. What are you asking exactly now?
In the 1990s, there was the beginning of something that, because of the expansion of internationalism, post-colonialism, conversations around cosmopolitanism that were emerging.
I get it.
There were like the Innova, or like different organizations around the world and there's another way that the conversation is happening now, I think. I'm just wondering what you think.
Well,
Do you
I mean,
think that conversation has changed,
I see, yeah. Well, you know, the thing about it is that a lot of those conversations, when they get processed out here, they have origins back in our social environments, you know. And so there's another kind of dynamic where, like, we are like the kind of site of raw material, and then these, you know, because some of these conversations, like William Sylvester Henry and Padmore and those guys, were like having those conversations in the sort of teens and 20s in the space between the two wars. And then, you know, it took a while to come into the mainstream, maybe in Britain through the Bristol and, you know, and then sort of, it's kind of weird for me, you know, as a person that studied in the US in the 80s, where you get people trying to sort of indoctrinate me into something, like almost commodifying something that I'm experiencing. And then, like, I have to kind of learn, you know, the language. You know, it's very complicated. You know, like it's something like the terminology becomes a kind of commodity, like decolonial or post-colonial. But I actually live in that space. It doesn't have a name. It's what I'm going through on a daily basis. You know, and I hadn't even thought of giving it a name. I just thought it was. There's a song by James Brown I've always liked in my teenage years. It's called Mind Power. And there's a kind of moment where he just says, it is what it is, that's what it is. And I don't want to be flippant and romantic about it, but it just gets to the heart of the point. Is that you're living in this space and you don't have a name for it, you're just going about your business. And then you kind of have this encounter with the cultures that have names for things, that have chronological enterprises around the names for things. And then you have to account for yourself. So my kind of dodge is that I don't know if I'm really coming, because it's a big problem in terms of, I've been involved with like academic practices and different things, you know, and critics. And one of the most frightening moments for me in my career is when somebody looks at me and says, you were doing this, and then they start to quote something. And then I'm thinking, but I didn't even read that, you know? And oh, so this makes my thing real now because you read the text. So I am now an illustration of text. But this is about me, this is my experience. It's not available to be an illustration. You know, so it's a very, very complex relationship to, I suppose, across cultural divides. And so I'm not saying this like it's a, you know, disparagingly. I'm just saying it's different systems. And I think fugitivity exists at that juncture, where sometimes in other readings, like to close off this conversation in a way, I remember years ago being invited to a presentation by a colleague where they were doing this video, and the video recreated, what you would call it, a conversation piece, you know, where like a kind of woman in a parlor on an estate with her children. And it was superimposed with an invisible, a transparent image of a black woman, like a worker on the plantation moving around. So the woman is static and the plantation worker is invisible and moving around. And the conversation that was taking place afterwards, people said, oh, it's so good that you're making this thing visible. You're making these people's stories visible because we don't know about all these people that died and worked on the plantation. And I was sitting down there and thinking, actually to not be visible is actually better because they're mobile and they're moving around while these two people are static. You know, and I was kind of like, wait a minute, this whole thing is being read differently. I could find another reading, if you understand what I'm saying. So yeah, it changes as you go along, you know, and it's never, you know, I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of where my head is, yeah.
Yeah, I think identity politics, you know, they're a trap. And I think they create this space where we always have to be explaining ourselves. And I think it's Glissant who says, as for my identity, I will take care of it myself. Like, I don't want to discuss it with you. It's so personal. Like, it's almost like someone trying to touch your hair or something. Someone you don't know, that is. And I mean, I've always been wary, coming from South Africa. I mean, I think that's why we started the Center for Historical Reenactments, in order to think about how we talk about ourselves, so that it doesn't feel like we are selling, you know, a go fest and and the world, you know, of course there was a moment where the world wanted this story. And I was more interested in how this language can be poetic and so that it can clear a space where we can get out of it, you know, get out of the loop that we, you know, identity politics traps us in. So, I mean, I think this, at least for me, is very apparent in the exhibition. And I am not interested in delving into people's identities when it comes to the work that they're doing. I'm more interested in conversations that spark questions, perhaps new questions or old questions that are phrased differently in order to produce new conditions for being in the world. Is that a hand? Oh. Okay, with those words, thank you very much for being with us, and thank you, Chris. And I just, hello. I would like to say one more thing. Chris is here for until the end of July, and there will be another event, public program event at ZKU as part of the Spicer Kino. So Chris will curate a series of films at ZKU and with food and discussion. So please follow our events on our website and Facebook page and Instagram. Thank you and see you again soon. We are not undone yet.